Everyone's happy? Great. Well, good afternoon, everybody. Thanks for coming. The purpose of this briefing is to update you on New Zealand's response to the conflict in the Middle East and to give you a chance to ask any questions you have about that response and to ensure all media outlets have the same information at the same time. In terms of our economic response, ministers are meeting daily to update on the situation and the potential implications for New Zealand. We're also going ahead with a weekly strategic meeting at which further decisions are being taken. We're also receiving written situation updates twice daily, and of course I updated Cabinet today on our strategy to date. There are three parts to our strategy. The first is focused on supply chains, including critical goods. The second is about potential and anticipated freight disruptions, and the third is about our economic response. So let me make a few comments about each of those key areas. The first part of the strategy is about anticipating and potentially, if needed, mitigating the impact of the war on critical supply chains, including consideration of steps that may be needed to ensure the resilience of New Zealand's industrial and economic capacity. Core issues in the supply chain, which we have a high level of focus on, are fuel, but also fertilizer, plastics and bitumen. On fuel, as MBIE's published data shows, current orders are secure and we have normal levels of stock in the country and on the water. MBIE have published an update as of midnight March 8, which shows industry's confirmed stock levels for petrol, diesel and jet fuel, with petrol coverage at 57 days, diesel at 49 days and jet fuel at 47 days. And while we acknowledge that not all of that stock is yet in country, much of it is on the water, and I'm advised that as of yesterday, 13 vessels were safely on their way here, with a further 3 safely scheduled to depart. We will be updating the data on the day's cover that we have by Wednesday this week, and we're working with the fuel industry to ensure that we can provide more timely updates in future. It has been observed and reported on that demand at some petrol stations has increased, and we will factor that into our future updates. Channel Infrastructure, which operates New Zealand's largest fuel import terminal, has advised today it is not seeing any issues. Ships carrying fuel are continuing to depart for New Zealand and arrive as scheduled. Obviously, there has been an impact on price. Petrol prices have risen about 45 to 50 cents a litre, adding about $23 to the cost of filling an average car. We are acutely conscious of the impact this will be having for many New Zealanders. Diesel prices have risen about 72 cents a litre, adding about $36 to the cost of filling an average diesel vehicle. Despite these increases, prices are still slightly below their 2022 peak, although it is reasonable to assume they could go higher. If the conflict is prolonged, there could be a point in the future at which fuel importers do face challenges securing orders. That is because the Asian fuel refineries, who New Zealand imports most of our fuel from, do typically rely on the Middle East for their stocks of oil. In the first instance, we would expect those fuel refineries to be seeking supplies from elsewhere, as well as our own fuel importers seeking other supplies. Under the National Fuel Plan, we are working very closely with fuel importers and sector participants. We have a fuel sector coordinating group, which is critical to getting market insights about whether they are facing those challenges so that we can work effectively together to get out ahead of them. As a principle of our response, wherever possible, we are using existing mechanisms, existing plans to make sure that our response is timely and coordinated. We also have as a core principle working closely with industry and businesses that are affected to ensure government is reacting and being proactive in a timely manner. We do anticipate working with fuel companies if needed to help secure orders. There is a role for diplomacy here. That would include things such as looking at fuel specifications so that fuel importers could widen the areas in the world from which they source fuel. would also include things such as exploring options to coordinate with Australia and Singapore fuel industry participants. The Prime Minister has already engaged with Prime Minister Albanese, and his officials have been talking with all of their international counterparts in recent days to ensure that wherever we can work together, we are. Potential options would potentially also include, down the line, reducing the minimum stock holding obligations that firms face so that they can dip into the buffer that we have. That, of course, is what the buffer is there for. It is there for the potential disruption to supply. I note that Australia has already had to act to reduce its minimum stock holding applications. New Zealand isn't there yet. On fertilizer, key industry players have signalled there are sufficient stocks and supply of urea fertilizer for autumn application, but I do note that prices are rising. As of Friday, the price of urea was up 54% on the same time the previous year to US $591 a tonne. That will have profound implications for the international price of food. However, it is still 75% below the levels it reached in 2022 after Russia invaded Ukraine. On plastics, the Ministry for Primary Industries advises that our major agricultural exporters do rely on adequate stocks of packaging in order to export many of their goods. They advise they have sufficient stocks for the next few weeks and months, but officials are now checking with smaller businesses and remain engaged with exporters on what their main needs be. On bitumen, officials are conducting a stockpile of supplies in the country, but are estimating around 93 days of working stock currently at port. Turning now to the second leg of our strategy, this is around anticipating and mitigating potential freight and logistics challenges, which is shipping, insurance, air freight disruptions, costs and availability of shipping. With the amount of disruption we are seeing globally to shipping, it is foreseeable that New Zealand exporters and importers could face disruption. Again, we are working closely with industry to get ahead of that and to get insights about any issues. We have already been working closely through the Ministry of Primary Industries to allow some stock already on water to be re-certificated into other ports, that is, stock that was due to go to the Middle East, getting new food safety certificates so it can enter other markets. There has also been some goods turned around, and MPI has actively worked to increase cooperation on cool storage and the like so that goods need not perish. The third area of our strategy is anticipating and, to the extent possible, mitigating the impact on the New Zealand economy, including what could potentially be acute cost of living pressures for some households. I've spoken to each of the chief executives of the major commercial banks, and they have assured me that in the first instance they will be providing an umbrella to businesses that they already work with to ensure that they can take them through this challenging time. From the government's point of view, we need to ensure that any support we provide to households is temporary, is targeted and is timely. Officials have advised us explicitly that reducing fuel excise would send the wrong signal at this time and it would not be sufficiently targeted. The principles that we are using in all of this are that wherever possible, let's use existing tools and mechanisms, including ways of engaging with industries and potentially implementing the National Fuel Plan. Thank you. I'm happy to take your questions.
What wrong signal would reducing fuel excise send?
Well, we're conscious that the world is in an environment where fuel supplies have been limited by the disruption on the Strait of Hormuz, potentially reducing fuel stocks by up to 20%. So in that situation, dramatically reducing prices in a way that would encourage people to use more of something would not necessarily be prudent. We're also very conscious that we have just received a report from the Royal Commission which pointed out that in times of economic shock we should be careful that additional financial support is targeted and temporary. And in this case, my household simply won't need as much help with the cost of living as some other households. Very clear in my mind is the mother potentially living in South Auckland, who has no choice but to use her car each day to get to her cleaning shift at the airport. There is not a bus available for her at that time, and who is facing acute income pressure. We need to make sure that we have in mind those New Zealanders who face the most acute cost of living pressures, rather than having blanket responses which tie up a lot of others along the way.
What targeted options would target those type of people?
I have not taken advice to Cabinet on that yet, nor considered specific options. However, what I am candidly sharing with you today is that as we look at the petrol price and its trajectory, we are anticipating that were it to get to levels where we think it was putting acute cost of living pressures on households, then we would consider a timely, temporary and targeted response.
What level is that?
Well, at the moment, as I say, price levels have not reached the level we saw following the Ukraine crisis. I have asked my officials to model what price increases they think we will expect to see over the coming weeks, and to also model what impact we think that would mean for some typical households and families. Again, in our mind, we have those workers who are working very hard to support their families, who have no choice but to use their car to get to work each day, and who may suffer significant cost of living pressure over the coming period. I also have in mind the fact that some New Zealanders will, of their own volition, choose to take public transport, to carpool, to walk, and that is not a choice that the government wants to stand in the way of. The key thing here around inflation that I just want to share with you to put some of this in context is that, yes, the Treasury have provided me with scenarios of what these price pressures could mean, both for petrol but more broadly across the economy. And while those forecasts show inflation being higher this year than we were anticipating, even in the worst case scenario they provided me, which is for a prolonged conflict with oil prices continuing to go higher than they are, that is a conflict potentially lasting through the rest of this year, even in that scenario they are forecasting inflation at 3.7%. That's too high for my liking, but it's lower than Australia has today. They are currently at 3.8. The reason I share this point with you is to emphasise that New Zealand does enter this period of unavoidable international cost pressures from a stronger position than some other countries, and then from a stronger position than may have otherwise been the case. However, we think it is both prudent and responsible to think ahead and to make sure that we have the backs of working New Zealanders.
Just coming back to the excise cut quickly, is it safe to say that it's now off the table?
We do not think that would be the prudent step at this time, but what you shouldn't take from that is that we're not acutely aware of the price pressures some New Zealand families are facing or may face in the coming weeks.
Would you consider reducing costs for public transport, potentially targeting for service car holders, reduces demand for petrol, maybe lowers prices for those people who don't have that?
Our key focus is on ensuring the availability of public transport. Public transport in New Zealand is already subsidised both by central government and local government. There are many buses available and many spare seats available on those buses. There are also trains available, and again, many spare seats available on those trains. So it is really important that we continue that public transport support at this time, and we have asked officials to look at, are there any constraints which would prevent the availability of public transport options for New Zealanders that we should be mindful of or that we should be considering any action on.
So in that case, you're thinking less about the cost of public transport, more about frequency, reliability.
Yeah, the advice from officials is that what we have seen in the past is that when petrol prices are higher, more people will choose to use public transport. We just simply want to be assured that that is available to people and is functioning in a way that, where possible, it is a choice. I'm always mindful when I talk about public transport, but if you're living in quite a lot of regional areas of New Zealand, quite a lot of small towns, that's not a workable option, which is why I'm saying, well, we do need to think ahead to what are the cost of living pressures that a broader range of working families could face.
You said that officials have done some modelling prices that people could get to. Can you share that information?
No, officials are working on that modelling, was what I said.
Okay, is diesel the canary in the coal mine? You mentioned prices that have gone higher in terms of shortages. Is that what you're seeing?
Yeah, I think we've all learnt in recent weeks of this new phrase, crack spread. which sounds rude, but actually refers to the fact that we're not just worried about the oil price, but the growing gap between the oil price and the refined price for fuels. Jet fuel and diesel in particular are showing a bigger crack spread. And of course, in New Zealand's case, diesel is very important, not only for our agricultural industry, but for freight. It's how we get things around the country. And so we are conscious that the potential inflation effects we see in New Zealand are not just first order, the price you pay for petrol, it's also about the costs that adds to freight, distribution, and therefore the things that we shop and buy for.
So there might be a point in the future where fuel importers struggle to fill their orders. What is the actual likelihood of that? Is that a realistic possibility?
So I'm advised by my officials that is at least, in terms of having to move to any further mitigations under the National Fuel Plan, that's at least 3 to 4 weeks away. What we are working really closely with fuel importers to do is to understand, looking several weeks ahead, out to say May, how are you looking at securing future orders? Many of them already have orders in that are currently covered, but they don't, of course, have orders out into the never never. And we're conscious as we look out to a world where global fuel supply is far more constrained, particularly out of the Southeast Asian nations from which we import, that there may be a real race on to get those orders fulfilled. Now, in the first instance, we would expect fuel importers would compete on price, that is, they will pay more to secure those orders in future. But in the second instance, they may wish to look more broadly beyond the refineries they currently rely on to look at other sources of fuel from around the world. It may also be the case that in doing that, they say to us, well, to give us more options about where we buy fuel from, could you have a look at broadening the fuel specifications, please? May also be the case that New Zealand, working with Australia and Singapore, could work to secure more supplies for this region of the world. So those are the sorts of options that we're looking at. This is a diplomatic effort in part. New Zealand is working around the clock through our diplomatic networks to make sure that both on the one hand, our needs in terms of ongoing fuel supply are understood and prioritised, our existing commercial and trade obligations are upheld, but on the other hand, to work with other nations who are just as affected by this as we are, to say how can we work together to ensure that the fuel security of all of our nations is protected. Well, at this stage, we haven't had to make a judgment on that. What we are simply looking ahead to is that as refineries are looking in more directions for crude oil, that some of them who've previously simply relied on the Middle East may look more widely. Now, there are a number of avenues that they may look to. One is the release of US strategic reserves. Another is the release of Japanese strategic reserves. It is also the case that some of them may look to Russian cargoes of oil, many of which are already on the water. We have not been directly asked by any of the countries who we currently import fuel from to consider easing those sanctions. But as we look ahead, it is always possible that is one of the avenues that refineries go down as they're seeking more sources of oil.
What's the situation with Avgas, and particularly what's the likely impact on Air New Zealand?
Well, in terms of Air New Zealand, you've already seen them take mitigations to address the fact that jet fuel has gone up considerably in price, depending on where it's sourced, anywhere between 70% and 100% increases in price for jet fuel. Air New Zealand has in the first instance, of course, increased the prices. It is on charging customers, and it has looked to do some rescheduling of its flights. What we are seeing already is a demand response, which is to say there are fewer airlines flying, particularly out of the Middle East, which in itself reduces global demand for jet fuel. And it can be anticipated by market analysts that in an environment where jet fuel is very expensive, that many airlines around the world may reduce their flight schedules or the amount of flying that they're doing, which should mean that demand and supply can continue to reach an equilibrium. For New Zealand, can I just say, we view our critical airline infrastructure as essential. New Zealand remaining open and connected to the world through air flight is really important, not just for New Zealanders coming here or wishing to travel, but most importantly also for our air freight. So Air New Zealand being able to maintain its schedule is non-negotiable for us.
Are you confident that Air New Zealand's balance sheet can handle an elongated period of higher FBX prices?
Yes, the advice that I have received both from Air New Zealand itself and also the Treasury checking their homework is that for the foreseeable future they are in a position to withstand these price increases.
And just, you talked a reasonable amount, about 3 weeks to a month, because a fair bit of what's happened the last couple of weeks is going to be basically based in regards to what happened.
Yeah.
What does the situation look like for New Zealand in 3 weeks, 4 weeks time?
Well, it all depends on whether the strait is still closed or not. That is the key piece of information that everyone internationally is focused on. The second question is whether Asian refineries can gain access to alternative supplies of crude oil. And then the third question is whether importers can access alternative supplies of finished product. There are a range of scenarios in which, even with the strait open, we have to be realistic that there will be ongoing disruptions, both to the fact that there's already traffic of fuel that hasn't reached its destination in the normal time, there's backups in supply, but also the fact that there could be heightened risk and ongoing disruption. So, as I say, the advice I've received is that in terms of having to progress to any stronger mitigations under the National Fuel Plan, we're at least 3 to 4 weeks away. We believe that we would get at least 15 and more like 25 days notice if we thought that we were facing further restrictions and problems that required a response.
Minister, what conversations have you had, particularly with South Korea and Singapore in the past 24 hours?
Yeah, so the Minister for Energy has been at an energy security conference over the weekend where he has met with his counterparts both from Singapore, from South Korea, Japan and a range of other nations. I will get him to speak more directly to those engagements. But the core message from South Korea is that they are intending to keep their exports going at 2025 levels. Their concern there is to prevent people stockpiling, upping their orders above what they've previously ordered in order that they can maintain supply to existing customers. In the case of Singapore, it is also their intention to keep their commercial supply arrangements honoured. New Zealand has a very close relationship with Singapore, including a supply agreement which, while it has entered into force, is there in spirit and speaks to the fact that Singapore would look to New Zealand as a priority were there to be any measures restricting availability of fuel.
Speaking of stockpiling, we saw over the weekend petrol stations, particularly Gull, running dry, people filling up jerry cans, etc. What would be your message to those people?
My message to those people is we know there's enough fuel in the country right now that we're not going to run out any time soon. And look, I understand why people were flocking to Gull, which is people are shopping around for a bargain. I can hardly blame them for that. Gull have assured us that they have both enough storage and enough fuel on the way that they will be in a position to keep restocking their stations. That shouldn't be read as a sign that there is a national fuel shortage. From time to time there will be disruptions with individual fuel suppliers, particularly if they keep prices sharp. And I'd like them to keep prices sharp.
Back to Thomas's question.
Sanctions. Are you saying it's okay for New Zealand firms to buy sanctioned Russian oil?
No, what I'm saying is that we haven't had to give any consideration to changing our stance on that at this time.
Is it your understanding that there are any sanctions on fuel derived from Russian oil? I mean, NFAT's advice in October 2022 appeared to give importers carte blanche to import petrol and diesel.
At the moment, we don't rely on product that is made out of refined Russian crude. The fuel that we source isn't dependent on that. I'm simply being realistic that in the future there may be refineries around the world who access Russian crude who haven't in the past.
On any potential targeted help for people who need it, what's the thinking behind that for you? Would you go into cabinet with a number like $3.50, for example, $4 per litre? Like what?
Well, the first number I'd have in my mind is the number in the bank accounts of those New Zealanders who are most up against it, those people who work really, really hard and might really, really be struggling to get to and from work. The second number I'd have in my mind is the more than $100 billion worth of debt that the last government added and which the country is still trying to pay off, which is to say we're not in a position as a country where we can throw caution to the wind. Any money that we invest, either in household budgets or in actions to support our public services is money that we need to be able to fund both now and into the future sustainably. And so, having just read the COVID Commission report, which says be very careful in a global shock not to overdo it, that will be front of mind for Cabinet. Any support that we were to give would have to be very temporary, it would have to be very targeted, and it would have to be timely.
But why would you do that? So would it be $3.50 or $4, or would it be the length of time? Like, what is your thinking for New Zealanders who might be struggling already on this $3.50 number you feel comfortable with?
I'm simply anticipating that some New Zealanders right now will be saying, well, I know my petrol's gone up in price. It's not as high as it's been at periods in the past, but if it keeps ramping up significantly, will the government have my back? So there's two things that we are doing. The first is we are doing some modelling to see, well, how high could we anticipate it might go and how quickly, so that we can be clear with New Zealanders what that could look like. And then the second thing is we're saying at what point do we think that would have an acute impact on the household budgets of working New Zealanders, and is there a way in which we would appropriately respond to that, having been advised that simply reducing the fuel excise would not be the right way to do that, given that that would go far more universally and would end up supporting households like mine and Chris Luxon's who frankly don't need the support.
When you get that advice, because I think to Anna's point, there's got to be a dollar figure in your head where both the direct price that people are paying and the price that's just sloshing through every activity in the economy suddenly gets pretty painful, and you might deal with that in a different way out in excise. There must be a number you've got in your head that you're like, oh, that's the real pain point.
Look, I'm already hearing from New Zealanders who are feeling pain now, so I'm conscious that that's the backdrop. And when I hear that figures may go much higher, when you hear speculation of the number kicking up past $3 towards $4, I know that that's really frightening for people who are worried about how they'll meet their budget. And so I want to be able to give them some more clarity about if that were to occur, how quickly we would expect that to occur, and at what point the government would say, here's some temporary support to help you through that. Well, I am working with the Treasury, and we will have a range of options, and of course I'm mindful that any advice I receive on this I will discuss with my Cabinet colleagues before I progress, so they'll know about it before you do, Luke.
Do you have any idea of what those options are? I mean, if reducing fuel excise is not one of those options, what else is on the table?
Well, as I say, the other options that we would have to consider would be how do we target that support at those low and middle income working families who are most impacted by any acute price changes that we see. What is a mechanism that exists that is reliable? I am mindful that the cost of living payment famously ended up in the back pockets of French backpackers, dead people and many others. It was a novel mechanism and was not effective in reaching those who were most in need. So we would look to use existing mechanisms, we would look to use mechanisms that were highly targeted, and that could be temporary because we are not at this stage envisaging a scenario where fuel prices stay at this level into the future, although as I say, what I am looking towards is the fact that generalised inflation may be higher this year than I would have anticipated and that I'm comfortable with for New Zealanders.
So would that be making perhaps extra payments through working for families?
I'm not going to speculate on the tool or mechanism. Suffice to say that I would be judging any potential initiative against a number of core criteria. One, it cannot add more pressure to inflation. That would be cutting off our nose to spite our face. Two, we would need to be confident that it was prudent and sustainable within the fiscal strategy that we have set out. That's critically important because New Zealand borrows a lot of money from the world. Global interest rates are rising, and our ability to maintain borrowing at the levels that we have now rests on us having a reliable fiscal strategy and being seen to be prudent managers of funds. And three, to ensure, as I say, that the support would be timely, temporary, targeted.
What advice did you get on Saturday from the Governor of the Reserve Bank? I
met here on Saturday with the Governor of the Reserve Bank and the Treasury Secretary. In part, she debriefed me on the meetings she had with central bankers in Basel. In part, she shared with me what they're seeing in terms of the impacts that these events will have on global inflation. In particular, you can see this as a mixed picture for central bankers. On the one hand, they need to worry about financial stability. On the other hand, they're looking at inflation. One, the spike in prices, a supply-side shock, but also the potential downward impact on consumer demand and firms' investment decisions. And so they're all having to weigh up what that means for their monetary policy decisions. She shared with me and highlighted that in this instance, New Zealand perhaps is somewhat fortunate in that other central banks around the world will lay their card first. We will have updates this week from the Reserve Bank of Australia, from the US Fed, from the Bank of England, and so that will give New Zealand a better picture of how other countries are considering this. The Reserve Bank Governor confirmed her intention to give a monetary policy update on the 8th of April. Ahead of that, she will also give a speech next week in which she outlines some of her thinking. I do want to leave it to the Reserve Bank Governor to outline her thinking rather than me paraphrase it for her.
MB's latest advice on fuel stock is on for the March at the 8th. Do you know how much fuel stock we have today?
No, but what I do have is a clear update that there is still sufficient stock in country to meet minimum stock holding obligations in storage, which, as you'll recall, are the minimum of 21 days storage. No fuel companies have advised us that they've gone below their minimum stock holding obligation, and I've also been advised that there is plenty of fuel on its way here. I appreciate that it's frustrating to have an update that's a few days old, which is why we will provide another update on Wednesday and why we are going to work with the industry to see whether we can have more frequent reporting on that availability. I do have enough information and data to once again assure New Zealanders there is plenty of fuel stock in the country right now, and there is plenty of fuel stock on its way.
That high demand that we saw over the weekend in the last few days, would have that depleted the stock more than may have been expected?
You would expect that potentially daily volumes consumed may have increased. At the same time, what MB have advised me is that in the past, when fuel prices have increased rapidly, as they did when Russia invaded Ukraine, they also at the same time see a drop-off in demand for fuel as people are more careful about when and how often they fill up. It may be that that's the case. I simply don't have the data to confirm that for you, but I understand why you're interested in that. I am too, and we're working with the fuel companies to get that information. I'm mindful we're working really closely with these fuel companies. We want to work in a way with them where they're giving us information that New Zealanders need and that is useful, but also making sure that they are thinking strategically, they're thinking ahead, they're focusing on fuel imports. So we're trying to do this in a way that doesn't create bureaucracy, but does get you the information you need.
Contracts which are on their way here, which are on the ships, turn around and cancelled. Will you be transparent with that and let the public know?
Yes.
Minister, would you encourage people to perhaps ease back on the accelerator if they can? Perhaps drive at 100 rather than 110 hertz allowed? Perhaps consider working from home if that was an option for them?
You're never going to... I'm very reluctant to adopt the role of the school mum telling people what to do with their own lives. People will make their own choices. People's circumstances vary considerably, their budgets vary considerably, their needs vary considerably, their work obligations, their family obligations vary considerably. People are mindful, and New Zealanders are sensible. I think most Kiwis understand that if you've got less stuff in the back of your car, you don't need as much petrol. If you don't drive as fast, you don't need as much petrol. That if you want, you can carpool with a neighbour. They don't need me giving them a lesson on that. Well, look, the National Fuel Plan does envisage that at a point where we did think that it was necessary, we could move to do public information campaigns to support New Zealanders to better understand their choices about how they could, through their own actions, reduce fuel use. We haven't decided to enact a campaign of that sort at this point. We don't think it's necessary at this point, but down the line, if we viewed that that was prudent, then we could do that.
Earlier you referred to a worst case scenario where inflation got up to 3.7%.
Yes.
Where did that come from? Where did that figure come from? Did you get that view, and what are the other scenarios?
Well, look, I just first want to put the caveats out there. This is very, very difficult for forecasters because they're not just trying to forecast what would the economic impact of particular events or price spikes be. They're also trying to anticipate what those very events might be. And so even that number that I share with you is somewhat dated in that it was a figure that the Treasury put together some days ago. And a lot has happened in the world since then. But what they did do as a scenario was they said, in a worst case scenario where you have a prolonged conflict, you see the oil price going as high as $135 a barrel, you see a very significant impact on global growth and output. How might we see that flow through to the New Zealand economy? And in that prolonged conflict scenario, which is the worst case scenario they presented to me at that time, they did anticipate that inflation this year could reach as high as 3.7%. I'd note that there was also a scenario that they gave me in which they thought inflation would only get to 3.2%, still out of band, but not nearly as high. So that's where that number comes from. I just also want to note this, because I'm really concerned that New Zealanders watching today will form a view that that this is devastating for our economy. What I absolutely acknowledge is we would far prefer this wasn't happening to the New Zealand economy, and it's not good for the New Zealand economy. But in all of the scenarios that Treasury have shared with me so far, and I provide that caveat, they still see the New Zealand economy growing strongly this year. The lowest rate of growth that they forecast in the scenarios they shared with me was 2.5%. That is a healthier rate of growth than we experienced last year. I just want to provide some context and perspective.
The umbrella that the commercial banks said that they will hold up over their customers, what is that umbrella?
Well, look, I'll leave the commercial banks to speak to that themselves. What I sought to understand from the banks is what they're seeing already with their customers, whether they have any particular concerns for sectors, industries, whether they're seeing particular customers impacted in specific ways. And so I will leave them to share that on their own terms. But what they, to a bank, identified was that many bank customers judge their bank by how it treats them in hard times, and they all want to be seen as being good bankers that don't abandon their customers in difficult times. They all acknowledge that the impacts of events like this are really variable. You know, you'll see one firm that will have its fuel price completely hedged to the end of the year, and so doesn't feel any impact. In fact, potentially sees it as an upside. Another firm down the line might not have any fuel hedging and might find themselves very exposed. So they acknowledge that the picture is variable. They know their customers best. They understand what the underlying drivers of their business models are and what might be needed and for how long.
If push comes to shove, how comfortable would the government be considering using fuel from Russian origins, and what would be the level of reticence given?
I'm just not prepared to comment on that at this point when it's not a live request that has been brought to us, nor is it a matter that the Cabinet has given consideration to at this time.
But if it's not being ruled out, that says enough to people, right? That it is something that's on the table. If you're not able to rule it out.
Well, I'm just simply mindful that the US administration in recent days have themselves relaxed some of their settings in regard to Russian oil.
We're talking about the fuel companies don't need your permission to do that now, do they? NFAT's advice in October 2022 clearly said that when they're looking at the origin of fuel, it's the place where it was refined, not whether it came from.
That's right. So the issue really is for, as I set out earlier, the refining nations from whom we source fuel, who may have their own restrictions on where they source fuel around the world. They may, and I don't want to get ahead of those sovereign nations, that is their decision, but we can anticipate that some of them who can't get crude oil out of the Middle East may be looking to the US, they may be looking elsewhere, and I'm not discounting the potentiality that they look to other sources, but I don't want to get ahead of those sovereign nations and their decisions.
Just back on inflation, you've obviously said today that the numbers indicate it could go up to 3.7%. Yesterday on Q&A, you said that the kind of modelling showed it could go between upwards of 0.4 to 1%. The number is currently 3.1%. So doing the maths on that could go to 4.1%.
No. So this is where you'll recall I did that bit where I said, bear with me.
Yeah.
And that's because it's complicated, because you have to do it against the baseline of what was going to happen with inflation. And what was going to happen with inflation was it was going to come down considerably, down to 2.7%. So the 1% is additional to the 2.7, so up to 3.7. So that's higher than it would have otherwise been. We were looking ahead to a period in which inflation came down significantly towards the midpoint of the target band. We're now able to anticipate scenarios in which inflation goes higher, and I've outlined to you what is the current worst case scenario I've been provided. But I do want to note you've seen a range of bank economists in recent days come out with a range of predictions, and they're all saying the same thing. Really, it all depends on how long the Strait of Hormuz is closed, how long this conflict goes on, what the impacts are and how nations respond. So this is a very difficult area to forecast. I think it's incumbent on me to be upfront with New Zealanders. Yes, there are scenarios here where this isn't good for prices.
We're talking about Russian oil. Would you expect those countries that we import the refined products from, if they were to change their source to Russian oil, would you be expecting them to notify you or to consult with New Zealand, or is you just find out?
Well, look, I expect that our diplomatic channels will be well engaged on that issue.
When we're talking about
the modelling, in terms of the Treasury modelling and that figure, can you just provide, you say that's for an extended conflict, what was the assumption there around how many months?
A conflict continuing throughout 2026 with significant flare-ups and escalation occurring, including on regional oil infrastructure, further increases to oil prices, more pronounced negative impacts on global growth, large increases to tradables, inflation, those sorts of effects.
So that's the worst case scenario, the best case?
Well, continuing the conflict prolonged with high oil prices spiking higher. They will have had a range of inputs into their model. I can't describe it in a way that's perfect. The point is there are still a range of scenarios, and if they were asked to submit a scenario today, it may look different from the one they submitted at that time. So I just want to be fair to my forecasting friends at the Treasury that all of this is very heavily caveated, but I do recognise that people want a sense of what we're thinking about here and how we're shaping and calibrating our economic response.
We're talking about the possibility of in the future of fuel rationing. People often reach to the Carl State example. Is that a genuine, realistic possibility?
Well, if you look at the fuel plan, which we published in 2024, and I just want you to remember that we're not without a plan here. These are events that have been planned for and anticipated. It sees that sort of thing as only happening in the worst case scenario, because what it says is its riding principle is you would only take measures that you think would genuinely strengthen fuel security. So that's actually an important test, because you can do things that look symbolic or sound good, but unless they're actually enhancing fuel security, we shouldn't progress with them. The first thing that the fuel plan says is during these times of heightened concern, we need to work much more closely with the fuel industry to understand what's coming at us. They need to have us supporting them to work internationally to diversify sources of supply if need be. We need to be diplomatically working with those nations from whom we source supply to ensure those channels remain open. It is the case, unfortunately, that price is part of how this will be rationed internationally, which is to say there are some countries in the world who are not as wealthy as New Zealand and may not be able to fulfil orders at the high prices that we may be able to anticipate. So New Zealand is further forward in the queue in that sense. But fuel importing companies we will work with to anticipate what's happening. The key issue that we are planning for is if there was to be a disruption in supply because there wasn't enough refined fuel coming out of those Asian refineries, what delays might we encounter in getting fuel from other places, say the US? How much longer might it take to get here? What other logistics challenges could we expect? And during that period of delay, would we have sufficient fuel in country through our minimum stockholding obligation that we would be able to withstand that delay and that pressure? So that's a scenario that we're planning for, that we will do scenario modelling with the industry on to understand. And we've asked them to just let us know, how are you going with your forward orders? What's that looking like? Many of them will be able to give us more information on that in the coming days and weeks.
To that question, are we still at level 1 of the plan, and what's the chance of needing to move to level 2?
Yes, we're still at level 1 of the plan, and as I say, I don't anticipate moving to a higher level in the plan until we were to see any actual disruption in ships being able to come to New Zealand.
So possibly 3 or 4 weeks would be the potential time.
Yeah, I'm advised that further mitigations under the National Fuel Plan are at least 3 to 4 weeks away.
Minister, what's your response to Fonterra CEO Miles Hurrell's resignation? Winston Peters says that they've gone from a nationalist company to a globalist sellout.
Well, I had the great privilege and pleasure of working with Miles Hurrell, and I think he did a great job for dairy farmers and for New Zealand's biggest cooperative. He was a humble leader. He worked his way up through that business. He started on the very ground floor, and he led through supporting people and making them feel capable of things that they might otherwise not have done. He was plain speaking. He was a good guy. He gave me massive promotion when I worked at Fonterra, one that I wasn't sure at the time I was ready for. He took me from talking about trade strategy to putting gumboots on a farm, managing farms, managing nutrients, managing a waste management company. And when I said to him, well, I'm not sure I'm ready, he said, well, if you were a guy, you would have said, how much will you pay me? So I like Miles Hurrell, and I wish him all the best for his future.
Can we wrap it up there, folks?
Just one quick question. How frequently can New Zealanders expect to hear from you? Obviously, you say ministers are meeting daily. Can they expect a daily update?
If there are material updates, then you can expect to hear from us. I'm reluctant to commit to a regular rhythm of meeting beyond that at this point, except to say that, of course, when you need to hear from us, you will. We will make ourselves available for the media's questions and for any issues that we see are arising in the public domain that require good public information.
So not necessarily doing monthly updates.
There's going to be no podium of truth.
Thank you.